I had a strange incident when I was a child during the 1990s. My cousins came over one night, and it was summer, and brought a Ouija board along with them for us to mess with. My cousin made us dim the light and got us to touch the moving piece as she started asking if anyone was there and if they were good or malevolent. Now this story was submitted by NoPrune2859, and it goes on to say that the piece was slowly moving, but I assumed it was just a cousin messing with us. I eventually let go and got up for some reason, and I began slowly backing up against the table. Then my elbow hit a can of soda that was on the table, and it fell and spilled on the carpet below. As I picked up the can, one of my cousins suddenly gasped and turned on the light. The soda spill was in a perfect shape of a heart. We just stood there shocked, and I got spooked and asked to put the board game away. They went home and left their board game with us, and the next night I was home alone. My sister was in gymnastics practice, and my parents went to go get her. I was watching TV when I heard a sound upstairs. Our house had an attic that my parents remodeled into bedrooms and a bathroom. One of our doors started creaking, and I heard actual footsteps walking around up there. There was no one home besides me. My heart suddenly sank, and I felt dread and even cold suddenly. I locked myself in the bathroom and called my parents, asking how far away they were. I think I got real scared, and I just decided to wait for them outside. When they returned, I couldn't for the life of me remember why I didn't tell them why I was afraid. Once we went inside, I looked around our attic and discovered my closet door was open. I then remembered about the Ouija board game that my cousins left here. I took the board game and I put it in a large trash bag and threw it out. I never had an incident like that occur in my life again, and never messed with those Ouija board games ever again. And anytime I see one at the store, my mind always goes back to that summer and what exactly I experienced. Has anyone else ever had something like that happen? Leave your answer in the comments. This next story was submitted by It's Rosa A. My family have always been strong believers in the paranormal, which is why for the majority of my childhood I was the odd one out. I never believed any of their encounters. I just took them all as silly stories they told me. The most ridiculous tale my parents, in fact, had told me was how when I was 3, they found me at midnight, sat at the top of the staircase talking to the ceiling. And apparently I was speaking to my great aunt, who they found out had passed away at 11 p.m. Anyways, when I was 17, I started working at a nursery as an apprentice in September. Now, the building was originally an orphanage for boys from back in 1800. It got shut down after World War II and was bought by the nursery owner in 1975. When I first joined, my coworkers would be telling me about how the place was haunted and all the typical stories you hear about the haunted places, those footsteps in rooms that are empty, seeing figures in the corner of the eye, etc., etc. I would just roll my eyes or play along with them, and I hadn't experienced anything for 3 whole months. My first encounter happened a week before Christmas. The nursery had shut early, and the staff had to stay back to take down the decorations. I was in the baby room by myself on a ladder, taking down the dangling snowflakes from the ceiling. I heard light footsteps coming up the stairs in the hallway, and assumed that the manager's daughter, who was also 3, was coming up to use the bathroom. I didn't hear anything more for another 10 or so minutes. Then I heard the baby room door open, and a few small footsteps entering the room. I saw a small figure out the corner of my eye. I said, "I've got a few more snowflakes to take down if you want to help," and was coming down the ladder. But when I turned around, there was nobody there. Just myself, the baby door wide open. I even checked the hallway. It weirded me out a little bit, but I just assumed she had come in and walked out without me hearing. But when I went to ask the manager a little while later, she told me her daughter had gone home with her dad an hour earlier. And that made me feel a weird tingling down my spine, but I just clued it up to me being tired. My next encounter would be a week after returning back from Christmas. I was covering in the preschool room, and we were leading a group of 15 in a line through the downstairs corridor to the garden outside. As they were walking, I noticed the little boy suddenly run into one of the side playing rooms. I called out and went after them. When I stepped into the room and looked, it was completely empty. I panicked, thinking that they had hidden. But when I turned around to let one of my coworkers know, they were looking at me weirdly, even some of the kids. I explained what had happened and they just said nobody had run off and everyone was still there. All 15 children. That proper freaked me out. And from then, a whole string of events occurred which has now made me feel like I'm a full believer. The amount of incidents would lead me to write a whole book, but here's a short list. A lot more incidents of the little boy running from the line, always to the same room, at least 5 times. I ignored it after the second time. Small footsteps along the corridors and the stairs, with nobody there when checking. Was talking to a little girl in the toddler room when I felt someone tug the back of my shirt. Nobody was there when I turned around. This happened several more times afterwards. A few times I've noticed that the babies and the toddlers just staring at the room door, some even giggling or waving at it. The only elements I didn't get was the sound of the child laughter, which a few of my old coworkers had heard, and quite frankly I'm glad I didn't and was relieved when my apprenticeship came to an end. Since being at the nursery, I don't know if some form of energy has clung to me or now that I'm a believer, I'm being made more aware, but I've been experiencing more encounters since, which I'll likely make a post about soon. This story was submitted by Cug Darter. When I was young, I lived in an apartment above a mechanic shop. Periodically throughout the year, there would be a loud knock on the front door in the middle of the night, without anyone ever being at the door. You'd be able to hear if someone was running down the stairs playing games, but there was never anyone there, just a loud knock, knock, knock that woke everyone up in the middle of the night. In another apartment my family lived in there was a previous renter who fell down the stairs and passed. We did not know until neighbors told us after 2 years of living there, but both my brother and I would always talk before about how we felt a strange presence in that hallway and would both run up the stairs whenever we came home because of the eerie feeling that we had. In that same apartment on 2 occasions, my stepdad was awoken from his sleep by a black face entity that he said was trying to take his breath from him and that looked like it was a black shadow figure of Medusa. There was also several occasions of knickknacks moving themselves from shelves. There was definitely a presence in there in that apartment. My brother's ex-girlfriend was playing with the Ouija board on the night before Halloween. They conjured a spirit that warned them they would burn. That same night, their house burned down and 2 people died. Another story that happened with me was when my brother and I shared the same dream of being abducted by aliens while we were at our cousin's house. We both described a thick fog that surrounded the house that was hovering over the lake in the backyard. The next thing we remembered was the room being filled with white light. We both hid under the futon in the living room as the front door opened and a gray alien walked inside in a black rubber suit. We did not share this with each other until we started talking about UFOs with a couple of his friends. When we both realized we had the same memory, we both became so bugged out that we became speechless, and my brother did not believe me. He started to cry after I told him the details of the fog and the cloud. Did we get abducted? I will never know, but the shared memory seems too specific to be a coincidence. This story was submitted by Anonymous. Years ago, my wife and I were in our sunroom watching TV one evening. I decided to go to our bedroom to watch another TV show on a TV there. I had left the bedroom door open about 2 inches. As a commercial came on, I shifted my gaze to the door, just not wanting to watch the ad. Then, I saw a figure walk past the door toward another door leading to the washer-dryer, and I thought my wife was going to come to bed, but before that checked to see if the garage was closed for the night. That or put some clothes in the dryer. After a few minutes or so, she didn't come back. I didn't hear the garage door close, and I didn't hear the clothes dryer start up either. So I got up and found her still in the sunroom watching TV. I asked her if she had left that room any time in the last few minutes. She said no. So I told her I saw someone walk past the bedroom door just a few minutes ago. She said she did go to the kitchen about 30 minutes ago, but the kitchen is in the opposite direction. So she then tells me that she had been thinking someone was in our house as she kept looking toward the other end of our house, thinking there might be someone in that direction. Then I realized she was wearing her pink robe. What I saw was black and white, so I'm left to believe I may have seen a spirit. Her suspicion of someone in our house was totally independent of my experience, but substantiated the possibility of a spirit. On another occasion, after the violent passing of my twin brother, I was watching TV in yet another room, and that was the living room. As I was watching TV, which was just left of the fireplace, my eyes were drawn to the wall to the right of the fireplace. There, I saw the silhouette of what I took to be the shoulders and head of a man, and as I watched it, it moved from right to left across the wall until it reached a hallway where it disappeared. I had been laying on the sofa, thought it was a shadow of someone in my house and maybe created by light in that room behind me, creating a shadow. I jumped up, turned around to see who was in my house, my fists at the ready, but no one was there. That's when the hair on my arms and the back of my neck seemed to stand. That scared me crazy. Both of these events actually happened after the car crash of my brother. Also, he was a realtor and once used our house as his office before we owned it. This next story was submitted by Koopa Phil. I have family in Ireland and they own a bed and breakfast as well as several other businesses. One trip we took out to visit them, the bed and breakfast was booked up, so they put us up in rooms and they had the dress shop next door. And the room I was in had been of a great aunt's of mine, I believe, and it had a bed, a dresser, and an old flat iron in it. The room to the door would not latch closed and always stayed open about a meter or so. I didn't think too much of it until I was getting into bed for the night. Across the hall was a linen closet whose door also would not stay closed. I swear I could feel something watching me from in there. I tried wedging the flat iron against the door of my room, but the door just pushed it aside and assumed its normal position, partially open. I gave up and had an uneasy night's sleep. The next morning, I asked my cousins if there was another room available and made excuses about the bed being uncomfortable. They said there was another room on the 3rd floor. My cousin Peter had used it for a time and it had a daybed in it. I moved my stuff up there, and that night I happily settled in. The door even closed properly, and I had a good night's sleep. Right up until the knocking started, anyway. I woke up just before dawn, and I could see a sliver of light on the horizon out the window, accompanied by an insistent knocking sound. I figured it was my cousins rousing me up to help me pick up supplies for their restaurant, and groggily opened the door. There was no one there. Listening, it seemed like the knocking was coming in from the wall that adjoined the bed and breakfast. I figured my cousins were pranking me, so I loudly announced I knew it was them and that I wasn't afraid. The knocking sound then moved across the wall, along the outside wall of the room, over the window, and then to the opposite wall of the room. I was now thoroughly freaked out. After a minute, I calmed down enough to try communicating with whatever was making this noise. I asked it to knock once for yes and twice for no, and tried asking various questions. It never answered, but the knocking did change intensity and position a few times. As the dawn grew brighter, the knocking slowly faded and then stopped completely. So I moved my stuff all back downstairs and slept in the room with the watcher. At least it was quiet. This next story was posted by Nervous Produce 244. My house in Amman, Jordan, is very haunted. Since the day we moved in, which was about 18 to 19 years ago, there has been so much activity. There are multiple instances and I will be talking about a couple. The shadow people. When I was little, I was sleeping next to my mom because my dad was away for work. I usually woke up around 7 or 8 a.m., but on that day I woke up at 5:30 or 6 a.m. I'd say. When I woke up, I looked to my left towards the side my mom was sleeping on, and I saw this figure of a shadow person. He had no face, but I could see the area where his mouth would be moving. I don't exactly remember how it was, but I know it was very odd because obviously the figure had no mouth, but it felt like a mask was over their face. When I looked at him, he was standing so close to my mom as if he was whispering something to her. That's until he noticed I woke up and I was looking at him. As soon as he noticed me, he looked at me, then quickly turned around and started moving inhumanely fast towards the door. It was so scary, yet I wasn't scared. It was more curious than scared because I ran after him, and when I reached the living room outside my mom's bedroom, we were on the second floor. The abat-jours, which are some types of curtains we have in the Middle East, were open. The thing is, we only opened them when we woke up, and nobody was awake at 6 a.m. Also, they're loud when they're open, so I would have heard him opening them. When I got to the living room, he was gone, but they were all opened. Never saw him again, but I still remember it so well. The second instance is the entities that are awake at night. I believe when we go to sleep, they wake up and start living their lives because usually around 3 a.m., we hear footsteps going up and down the stairs. We hear them calling out our names, them peeking through our, as in my sister and I's, slightly open door. Sometimes my sister would wake up with a bite mark or even a bruise. My grandma saw the same woman twice in the basement floor. We have a room down there. She would walk into her room, then outside in the main area where we had our closets. The layout of the closet is very weird, just don't ask. My cousin heard my mom calling out my sister's name at 4 a.m. When she asked her the next day about it, she told her she was passed out and fast asleep at the time, and she didn't call for my sister at all that night. We lived there for a few years, but then moved to Canada when I was 11. That was basically the last time I was there, and I turned 18 and went back to Jordan for a layover. Usually when we go to Jordan, I would stay at my grandma's house, but since it was a layover, my sister and I thought it would be fine to stay there for just one night. And keep in mind, we were scared out of our minds because that house traumatized us as kids. Anyways, we go straight to the basement, and our dad renovated the house, mind you, because it was falling apart before, and he kindly added an elevator that leads straight to the basement for my grandma because she couldn't go down the stairs since her leg was broken. So we go right up from my front door to the basement using the elevator, and we basically did not enter the upstairs area at all. While we were downstairs together, nothing really happened. My sister decided to go to sleep at 2 a.m., but I was still jet lagged and watching, so you know damn well I stayed up to watch it. The second it hit 3 a.m. is when it started going down. I was peacefully vibing, chilling, watching my show when I heard this loud bang upstairs. Now, of course, my fight or flight instinct kicked in and I obviously flew into my sister's bedroom. I ran as fast as humanly possible because I heard a door slam so hard as if they were mad at us and we weren't welcome. There were no windows open, there were no doors open because we never went upstairs. I've never felt more scared in my life because it sounded like they legit broke the door with how hard they slammed it shut. I calmed down a bit. I went to use the bathroom. I finished washing my hands. I turned off the tap and went to sleep. My sister wakes me up an hour later telling me to go turn off the tap. So I look at her in shock like, I turned it off just a while ago. What? Of course, she couldn't sleep after that, so she ended up packing our bags quickly and we dipped. I never really went back after that, but I did have a dream about the house that I still remember very vividly. It was about this little girl who was wearing a dress and one of those French painter hats. She had bangs and a short bob. She looked very cute. She led me upstairs to where our bedrooms are, and that's where I saw an old man staring outside the window. I remember when I looked at him, I became so creeped out and scared. Then I went into my room to look around, but nothing really happened. That's until I looked to my right at my parents' bedroom and see a bunch of mannequins that were headless, armless, legless, some of which had clothes on and some of which didn't. The little girl and old man were circling around them, just walking around them. It was very scary, to be honest. This next story is submitted by RedRust92. I had a habit of waking up in the middle of the night when I was just 6 years old. I shared a room with my older sister and we slept on the same bed. There was also the family computer in our room. So my mom would sometimes stay up late chatting with her friends, and these were her friends from back home. She's from Turkey. One night I randomly woke up and looked over to see what appeared to be a completely blacked out version of my mom sitting on the computer chair. She was pitch black, even though we had a bright light on in the hallway and the door wide open. The computer was only about 3 feet away from the bed. She was wearing her usual outfit and sitting in her characteristic pose, legs crossed with her hands resting in front of her knees. She was staring out the window, her face and body parallel to mine. I asked, "Mom, what are you doing?" No answer. Mom. Then, whatever it was slowly turned its head to look at me. It had no facial features, just a black shadow. It stared directly at me. I got so creeped out that I hid under the covers, turned my back to it, and hugged my sister tightly. I remember hearing some kind of growling or noise coming from outside the window, maybe like a cat. I was absolutely terrified, but I eventually fell asleep. The next morning, I asked my mom why she'd been in our room, and she denied ever being there. My mom isn't the type of person to scare us or play pranks like that. No drinking, no drugs, nothing like that. Which is why the story still haunts me to this day. Story submitted by Passy Panda R. My partner and I lived in our apartment for about a year and a half after moving from out of state. After about 6 months, we began experiencing minor paranormal activity. Footsteps, doors opening, closing on their own. We were okay with that because, other than that, the presence seemed benevolent. Things began to escalate this month, however, and I began having weird dreams of being watched by something. And one night, I saw a head outside our bedroom window. It ducked out of sight. I screamed in terror. The thing is, our window and apartment is on the second floor with no ledges, stairs, or anything outside of it. Just a long drop to the ground. A few nights ago, I woke up to tapping on my partner's studio window. Same setup as our bedroom. It was a rhythmic tapping with 6 taps consecutively and pauses in between. This was at 3:30 a.m. and my partner and I were wide awake. It continued for an hour, then stopped. Then, out of nowhere, we heard a loud growl mixed with what I can only describe as gremlin gibberish, like Taz from Looney Tunes, but angry. We froze, then stayed up for the rest of the night. We saged the apartment with white sage and dragon's blood, which apparently temporarily calms the activity, but we've noticed that it begins to slowly build back up after about a month or two. We have 2 cats. Our cats, they aren't very vocal, but one has been extremely more vocal in the past month leading up to this. Once we saged the apartment, he went completely back to normal. Does anyone know what this spirit might want, and should we sage more often? We're moving next year and are worried about it following us. This next story is by Initial Summer 4032 and is called Seeing Ghosts Changed Me. I had my first paranormal experience in 2010 when I moved into a 1-story apartment. Following a divorce, I moved to my hometown about 30 minutes away and found the cutest 2-bedroom apartment. It was single-story and connected to 2 other units. I was so happy to be closer to my family in the small town I grew up in, and my closest friends lived there too. I first noticed strange things happening about a month in, when I heard heavy footsteps coming from the ceiling. The attic had no real flooring, just insulation, so it didn't make sense that a person could walk across from one side of the house to the other. I called my 19-year-old brother to come over and look into the attic, as I was sure an animal was probably the culprit. He pulled the attic door down that was located in the hallway and checked. No critters or evidence of nests were found. Days later, I woke up around 2 a.m. to sounds of kids outside. I got up and stood in front of the open bedroom window and watched 4 children playing hide-and-seek in the backyard. They were solid, not see-through, and all 4 had on white pajamas, which struck me as odd. 2 girls and 2 boys, appearing no older than 5 or 6 years old, ran around, laughing and talking to each other for what seemed like 10 minutes. One boy hid behind an oak tree counting, while 3 other kids ran and hid. I assumed the elderly neighbor may have been babysitting his grandchildren and fell asleep, so they snuck outside to play. I later found out that he had no grandchildren and none of the neighbors had kids at that age. I didn't know what to think, and meanwhile, I would have terrible nightmares and hear strange noises at random times. Everything from doors closing to objects falling off shelves, and I was convinced that the landlord was remodeling the middle unit at 10 p.m. one night while I was watching TV, but I looked outside to see no lights on next door, and the parking lot was empty. I could smell random cigars on occasion, and my TV would change channels or turn on by itself sometimes. It never happened after I moved out, neither did the waking up in the morning to my comforter and blanket being on the floor, which happened almost daily. One night I couldn't get warm in bed, even wearing a hoodie, sweatpants, and even socks. I froze as I lay there listening to my trinkets move around on the dresser. I had the heat up, but it still felt like I was sleeping outside in the cold. I frequently called my friends or family members when I heard or saw something weird and wanted them to stay over. Some witnessed the craziness, so I felt relieved that I wasn't imagining it, as there was so much more that happened at that place, and someday I want to write about it. It changed a lot in me, like my views on the spiritual realm. I sought out information on energy and the paranormal. My beliefs changed after living with that experience, and I believe to my core that there is way more to this existence than we know. I believe in the afterlife and that we are all spirits having a human experience. Once our lives are over, we shed the meat suits, but our souls are eternal, hopefully not hanging out and scaring the living. This next story was posted by Business Body, and it's titled Skeptic to Believer. So I will start by saying that this was my first post on Reddit. I want to share something that was experienced by myself and my coworker while working third shift a few weeks ago. I haven't stopped thinking about it, and the few people I've told, I can tell just really don't believe me. I've been following this sub since, and the sub he's talking about is /paranormal, and feel the urge to share my experience. I can't disclose the exact location of where this happened, but I will tell you that it was somewhere where multiple people had been found deceased as a result of a natural disaster that occurred just a few days prior. My coworker and I were sitting outside around 4 a.m. eating a snack. We were the only ones on the property, no business for anyone else to be there, and it was very dark, the only light coming from the moon. Out of nowhere, we hear very loud singing, clearly a female. It is hard to describe, but the best way I know how is it was happy, confident, and kind of like how it sounds when someone hums or sings in the shower. We both looked at each other as if to confirm the other person had heard it. The look on my coworker's face confirmed he did as well. We stand up, and I was reaching for my flashlight when I saw a figure appearing to be walking right by us, about 10 yards away. Again, hard to explain, but just imagine seeing someone in the dark. It's really more of a silhouette. When I turned on my flashlight, there was no one and the singing had stopped. We were both dumbfounded. We searched everywhere and called out, but nothing. A few nights later, at the same place, my coworker and I were inside a vehicle when we had heard several drops of water fall on his arm. He looked at me and said, "Where did that come from?" The windows were rolled up and neither of us were drinking anything. Because of what happened prior, I looked this up and found out that it's a phenomenon that many have reported as paranormal. Skeptics would say that there has to be an explanation. I would have said the same thing, except that I was there and I saw 4 or 5 fat droplets on his arm that appeared from nowhere. I was never a believer in anything paranormal, but these things happened, and I feel differently. I don't know why or how, but I know for some there's some sort of in-between after they pass away. This story takes us deep into the deserts of Arizona, where an encounter with a being that many fear and few dare to speak of left one person forever changed. Now, this post was shared by Curious My Nature 1010 2 months ago on Reddit, and while their account may be brief, the details are enough to make anyone think twice about the unknown. It was 2008, and the user was near the old jail on 29th Street, a remote area with only a few homes back then. They were hanging out with a friend, surrounded by the quiet expanse of the desert, the kind of place where silence feels mostly heavy and not to mention alive. While sitting in a truck, something would catch this person's attention. Now, this feeling wasn't just paranoia or anxiety or a sense of dread, but this was something much deeper, something spiritual. They felt an overwhelming urge to look to their right, as if some unseen force was guiding them, and when they did, they saw it. Hovering there, about 8 to 10 feet tall, was a figure unlike anything they had ever seen. Its face and torso were hidden, but the creature's legs were clearly visible, not to mention long and muscular, like a horse's. And its feet? Well, they weren't human. They were in fact hooves. But what stood out the most were the horns, which curved forward on top of its head, adding to its towering, menacing presence. The being was moving toward them slowly, and that's when reality seemed to freeze. Time itself felt suspended. The user was completely frozen, unable to move, speak, or even process what they were seeing. But the person in the truck wasn't frozen. They were screaming, urging the user to get back inside. Somehow, they managed to do it, and this was despite their body feeling heavy with fear. Once inside the vehicle, the pair were so scared that they couldn't even drive. Their mind and body refused to cooperate. It wasn't until the user grabbed the wheel and, together, they would find enough courage to speed away, escaping what felt like an inevitable encounter with something beyond human comprehension. Years have passed, but the memory of that night has lingered. It wasn't until a medicine man cleansed their body that the full weight of the encounter began to make sense. And in fact, the night before the cleansing, the pair had seen a coyote, an important figure in many Native American spiritual traditions, which ultimately seemed to validate the cleansing as well as the strange feelings that Curious My Nature 1010 had felt that night in the desert. The user also mentioned that in their dreams now, they've begun to see more symbols. The coyote again, as well as the javelina. They've reported that both creatures have guided them through spiritual journeys, offering hints at a deeper connection between the skinwalker as well as their own life. And to this day, they believe that the encounter may have been a warning, possibly from their ancestors, pushing them to leave the person that they were with, a decision that may have saved them from something darker. And while the user heeded the warning and was able to escape, they did make one thing very clear. These beings aren't to be sought after, and what might seem like a message for some could in fact be a dangerous encounter in disguise for others.
Story by Faceless Spirit. Bit of background. When my wife was young, her parents and siblings lived with one set of her grandparents. Her grandfather was murdered in the home. It happened in his bedroom upstairs. The room was used primarily as storage for the next 20-plus years. Her parents tried to sell the house multiple times, but living in a small town, everyone knew about the grandfather, thus the house would not sell. So they stayed. Years later, and while my wife and I were engaged, there was a murder trial which I attended in support of her family. I saw the crime scene photos. Important later. Another few years later, we had 2 kids. The oldest was 6 at the time. My wife's family does not talk about the murder, and our kids do not know about the murder to this day. My father-in-law decided he wanted the room where the murder happened to be a hangout for the grandkids when the family was in town. He put sleeping bags and a TV in the room in preparation for a holiday, days-long get-together. We didn't like it, but stayed silent since the murder was a sore subject. My father-in-law also wanted all the grandkids to sleep in there together. We were the first to arrive, and my son went into the room alone. He usually couldn't sit still long at that age, so after a couple of hours I decided to check in on him. Here's our conversation. During the whole conversation, he was still and rigid, and would not look away from the TV. "Hey, buddy, Is everything okay up here? Okay, have fun. Daddy, do I have to sleep in here? I don't want to. Why not? I'm not alone. Every hair on my body stood up. Well, yeah, I'm here with you, buddy. No, there's someone in here with us. Are they nice? Mean? A grown-up? A kid? A grown-up. What are they doing right now? They're watching you. You have never said anything like this at your grandparents' house before, and you have been here a lot. They don't leave this room, and I've never been in here before. Where are they now? Without looking away from the TV, he points to the far corner where his great-grandfather was murdered and said, They're standing over there. They don't move much. Okay, buddy, you don't have to stay in here. And he left the room with me. Story by Reader of All Things. I honestly believe my family is haunted. So many things have happened my whole life, no matter where we live. When I was a young teen, my sister woke me up saying someone was in the house. We stayed up all night listening to what sounded like boots walking through the house. My mom, no one believed me, but weird stuff happened there all the time. One night we were at church, and later I overheard my uncle saying someone kept ringing the doorbell, and when he went to open the door, no one was there. But at that exact moment, someone knocked on the back door. Walked to that door, and it switched to the front. They lived out in the middle of the country, and the nearest neighbor was an hour away. Moved into a trailer when I was a little older. Also in the middle of nowhere. I was maybe 14. Me and my sister every night would hear what sounded like whispering but more electronic-like. The best way to describe it is that it sounded like a radio turned to a talk show, and it was so low we couldn't understand what they were saying. Couldn't hear it outside or anywhere else but in our room. We heard it so much we got used to it, even though we never could figure out where it was coming from. Also would hear whistling outside our window at night. Became an adult. My daughter would wave at people in our house, and when I asked who she was waving at, she said, Mister. One time she was walking down the hall and said, Excuse me, mister. My other daughter had so many imaginary friends where she described how they died. I really believe they were ghosts. I live in a different house. The kids are a little older, and my daughter described to me being in her room and a woman standing in her doorway with long, gross nails. My daughter, 2 days later, described the same thing, not knowing what the other had seen. A few years after that, we bought a new construction house, hoping that would help, and we hear what sounds like someone running up the stairs. One morning, I woke up early and walked into the kitchen, and I heard someone say, Good morning. I replied, Good morning. I'm going to cook breakfast. Want some? No answer. Checked the house, and everyone was still asleep. But no one has ever been malevolent. I'm not sure why we have so many ghostly issues, but the worst was when my youngest daughter woke up to this weirdly shaped handprint on her leg. Story submitted by Anonymous. I've always liked cemeteries, one in particular on an old back road in my little town. The graves ascend a hill, and at the top where the hill descends, it's like a lookout. There's a pond, and it's a hilly area that's just beautiful. I go there often, especially when I need to clear my head. I've been connected to spirits my whole life. So when I go, it's not odd that a spirit communicates with me. I quite enjoy it. I always state I'm not there to offend anyone and normally carry a crystal for protection just as a precaution and for respect. Backstory and setting aside. My encounter. I go on a cloudy day. It was a rough one and I needed my space, so to the cemetery I go. I do my normal entrance script. I have a path I take, but I feel drawn to the third row of graves and notice a grave I've never seen in my 2 years' worth of visitation. An old grave, for that matter, in the shape of Roman numeral 3. 1 stone for 3 graves. And the only date I can make out is 1800, the year they passed. I instantly heard a male voice in a joking tone. Pretty old, huh? I gave a laugh and felt happy. This was a good man. I began to follow my normal path to the top, and I get a sinking feeling to go no further. I physically couldn't go past this grave of the man. I get confused, and as I'm getting worried he is bad, from the spot I normally sit, I hear a deep growl. It chilled me to the core, and I heard a clear, "Go." It was the man's voice. Not ominous, protective. I quickly started back to my car. My phone started messing up. I was horrified. I haven't been back yet. I'm convinced the male spirit I encountered protected me, and I want to speak with him more, or go leave some flowers soon. But I'm unsure. Story submitted by Scooter books. I'm clairvoyant, and I surprisingly feel peace most times at graveyards. However, I live in Salt Lake City, Utah, which some of you may know as the Mormon capital of the world. Now, not to be too political, but the Mormon pioneers did some messed up stuff. Owning several slaves, practicing polygamy, just stuff to make your stomach twist. In my city's cemetery, which, fun fact, is the largest city-run cemetery in the U.S., there's a huge diversity of graves, but the graves are segregated in such a way it makes me feel a little unpleasant. All the old Mormon guys everyone loved are in one part, Jews in another, soldiers in another, immigrants and non-white people in another. I don't know, that just doesn't sit right with me. I always get overly anxious at the Mormon section of the cemetery, not trying to be prejudiced at all, just stating how I feel, and I always avoid it because of this. I feel watched, judged, almost if someone's going to creep up behind me and grab me. About 30 minutes south in a much smaller cemetery, also full of Mormon pioneers and high-ranking LDS leaders, there's another cemetery. I went with my boyfriend at the time at about 8 p.m. one winter. It wasn't too dark, and there's lights all around, so it shouldn't have been too spooky, at least in my mind. I roam cemeteries often as, again, I mostly feel peace. Well, we were walking around and I commented on a stone I saw. I wasn't rude or making fun of it or anything. I think I just said something about the age of the stone. Well, right as I said it and passed it, I felt this strong, angry female energy, and both I and my skeptic, at the time, boyfriend heard footsteps behind us. These footsteps followed us around for a while, so we both got freaked out and decided to leave. Right as we got to the gate of the cemetery, I heard a psst sound behind me. I turned around quickly, only to see a shadow standing with blank black eyes staring at me. Needless to say, I got the fuck out of there, and haven't been back since. Spooky. Story submitted by Unique Ad 9201. I lived behind a graveyard. Yep, that's right, my family's house backs up to a graveyard. In fact, we back up to one of the oldest cemeteries in the state. From my understanding, the land my neighborhood was developed on in the 1970s was originally a fruit tree farm. Each of the homes on the street still has at least one fruit tree on their property as a relic of the farm. My family had an apple tree. I know that these stories should always be taken with a grain of salt. I consider myself a pretty level-headed person. My parents are physicians and we operate under a very practical, realistic way of navigating life. And even with that understanding of how the world works, we have experienced things that we have never been able to explain. Growing up, the house always gave me an uneasy feeling. I constantly had the feeling I wasn't alone. I've had something knock on my window in the middle of the night. I've heard footsteps down the hallway. I've seen an apparition, seen things fly off the table, and had countless other experiences, big and small, that were just normal occurrences. My mom also had interesting experiences, including old toys turning on when they have no batteries, being pushed from behind while gardening, and seeing unexplained things from time to time. There would be periods of more activity and periods of quiet. During the active moments, we would refer to the house as being loud. It was the loudest when one of us would get sick. Perhaps one of the strangest moments was when we found a bone in our backyard. When the bone was examined by our local forensics team, it was concluded that the bone was part of the end of a human femur, with unknown origin. They didn't give a date, but they did say it was likely several hundred years old. Weirdly enough, we found it by accident. One morning, it was sitting on top of a flower bed maybe 20 feet from the house. At this point, the bone is family lore, as we have never been able to explain its existence. There has never been any evidence to suggest someone was buried outside of the cemetery lines, but it certainly makes you wonder. No other bones were ever found. If you're wondering what we did with the bone, well, we kept it. Actually, when the very quick investigation concluded, a police officer came by to drop off the bone. Weird move, but we didn't know what to do, so we took it. Since that moment in 2006, it has sat on the mantel above our fireplace. The bone ended up setting in motion a specific series of events that ended up coming to our family's aid later on in life. So we keep it up as a reminder of that moment. Story submitted by Kieran7. Creepy things happening in a graveyard. Shadow Man. On the night of April 13th, 2020, a friend and I were walking past a graveyard that I had been in several times during the day, but never at night. Not for any specific paranormal reason, just I don't want to go into secluded areas at night. I looked into the graveyard from behind a 1-meter-high wooden fence that surrounded it, and saw something strange. The area is surrounded by trees and gravestones, but I swear I saw the outline of a person. I think he was wearing a black suit from the glimpse I got, as well as black pants and a black hat, but it was extremely hard to tell, and it could have been any color, just not visible in the black of night. My first instinct was of a person paying their respects late at night, and then I saw the shadow walk behind a large tree. In the direction that he was walking, I should have seen him walk back into my view on the other side of the tree, but he didn't. I asked my friend and we decided to investigate. We walked a bit to get a quick view of behind the tree. Unless the person had ran, we should have been able to see him walking away or standing behind the tree, but we didn't. It was almost as if he had vanished. We walked into the graveyard, which by the way had cameras and was legal to walk into 24/7, and walked up to the tree. Behind the tree was an unmarked grave. No headstone, but a single rose that looked fresh, not wilted at all. Now, obviously, we chalked it up to a normal person, nothing paranormal about it. I guess he just slipped out of our field of view and went far enough away that we couldn't see him. Then we realized our footprints were clearly visible on the dirt around where he was standing, but his weren't. We came back the next night for the shits and giggles, and saw the same figure, same height, same clothing, at the same spot we were when I caught a glimpse of the man standing next to the same tree. It appeared as if he turned his head at us, then back in front of him and walked behind the tree again. We did the same thing. We walked back up to the tree and didn't find any sign of him, despite the fact that it was like a 30-second walk, and the pace at which someone walks in 30 seconds should not put him outside our field of view. No footprints or disturbed dirt, and the rose was gone, even though I had visited earlier in the day to attempt to photograph the grave and it was still there. My friend said it was very strange that, had it been a real person, we caught him 2 nights in a row around the same spot, at different times of the night. We went there the next 2 nights and nothing. We didn't see him again. Had we just caught a ghost in a graveyard? I guess we'll never know. Story submitted by Jaybird Take Flight. I've been drawn to the paranormal since an early age. There was a small cemetery in rural Illinois that I'd go to at night to take pictures from grade school through early college. It was fairly old. There were graves from the 1800s as well as people from today. There wasn't a lot of houses around either, just farms spread across cornfields. Over the years, I collected a few pictures of orbs and some mists, a few of which are here. I've had quite a few experiences as the result of these visits. The one that makes me feel the least comfortable goes like this. It was a quiet night at the cemetery taking pictures with my father and younger brother. The early days of my excursions out there in the dead of night. No strangeness or anything out of the ordinary occurred while we were there. Just a cool night out in the country under a billion stars. When we got home, we put my dad's SD card in the computer and discovered he had gotten quite a good picture of a ghostly mist over a grave. I don't have the picture, but it looked like you could have been holding a lit cigarette under the lens. You get the idea. Not long afterward, our dog started barking out the window next to the computer. He barked consistently for 20 minutes. It wasn't odd for him to bark outside. It was the timing. So we went outside and looked around, but there were no squirrels or any other creatures of the night. So I went to bed and passed out. I opened my eyes to see my red digital clock was at 3 a.m. on the dot. I sleep with no lights, so my room was pitch black. And over the stillness of the night, I heard this faint sliding sound. It was very smooth, like soft wood on carpet. My eyes were open, but my mind was mostly asleep, so I didn't really process the sound and went back to sleep. I woke up in the morning for school and looked at my desk in the corner of the room. The wooden chair had been pulled out from my desk and turned to face my bed, perfectly. My desk was right next to the door in my room, and if the chair wasn't pushed in, then I wouldn't be able to get out, so I always kept it in when I wasn't using it. The implication of that still gives me chills every time I think about it. That experience changed the way I approached the paranormal. Since then, when I'm leaving a place after poking around, I'm always very polite but firm in saying out loud that potential spirits are not welcome to follow me home, and it's pretty much worked for me ever since. I ended up having a few more strange things happen in my room over the course of about a year. There'd be occasional but very obvious feeling of a presence, day and night, and one night I was wide awake in bed when it felt like someone sat on the end of it. I made a bargain with this spirit not long after that. If it must stay, then it can have my room for half the day when I was gone, but must leave me alone when I'm at home. I was never bothered again. That's one of my experiences. I hope this thread grows. I think it'd be cool to have a bunch of popular themed experience threads going. P.S. I want to note that I was about 12 when this happened to me, so if the notion of talking or bargaining with spirits seems silly to you, that's the age in which it sprung from mind. But let me tell you this, it works. Story submitted by Oak2373. Paranormal experiences working at a funeral home and cemetery combo location. Like the title suggests, I work in death care at a combo location funeral home, meaning that we have a funeral home, cemetery, and a crematory on site. I know people like to debunk stuff on this sub for good reason in a lot of circumstances. So I wanted to see the response to some stories from my coworkers and I. I'll start off with the typical light stuff. One of my coworkers tends to come in very early every morning to start at her work, while I like to stay late. We both spend a good amount of time alone in the funeral home. We both have had experiences of hearing footsteps down the halls, wood floors and long hallways that echo, seeing things out of the corner of our eye, and hearing faint voices. Not too surprising considering there are an abundance of loved ones in our care at any given time, some having more traumatic passings than others. I will admit, though, that the funeral home itself is pretty tame. There have been many strange occurrences in the cemetery experienced by the grounds crew, cemetery staff, and the funeral home staff. One day, I was standing a service early morning and turned and saw a man under a tree not too far away from me. He looked out of place and I saw no cars around besides the few the family drove. I turned to look at him once more. Then, for a third time a minute or so later, and he had vanished. This has happened to multiple people. Mind you, we have 17 gardens. I would have seen him walking away or would have seen the car he was in. A co-worker of mine on the cemetery side worked with a man for a while after his wife passed. He wanted a granite pedestal, a stand that holds an urn with customizable toppers, with a bird bath on top. For about a year he would hound my co-worker wanting to know when it would arrive, when that is unfortunately the expected waiting period for custom granite memorials. When it finally arrived, we placed his wife inside and had a service. A few months after, my co-worker who worked with him woke up from her sleep because she kept hearing bird bath, bird bath, bird bath being yelled in her ear. She actually came in the next morning and said he died before we even received the first call, notification of a death. Lastly, to avoid this being too long, is 2 stories about our chapel mausoleum. It is the only mausoleum on site with an interior and has large stained glass windows and rows of chairs to sit and visit loved ones, or for when services are held inside. This mausoleum is locked every day at 4 when the grounds team leaves and is unlocked around 6 to 7 a.m. One morning, one of the guys walked into the mausoleum after unlocking it to turn on the lights and saw a woman sitting in one of the chairs by the windows facing away from him. He freaked out and walked out to call the superintendent. When he walked back inside, the lady was gone. There was only one entrance to that mausoleum that he was standing right in front of. We hear knocking and shifting noises all the time in the mausoleum. It is so prevalent, I actually address everyone in there when I enter and exit to avoid any bad juju. We had a maintenance crew working on the mausoleum for a while that would come in every morning to find their tools moved all around the room. They would set them on one side of the chapel and come back to them on the other side of the room. One of the workers said he would never come back. Well, this post isn't very short. This is the shortest I could make it. The cemetery truly is spookier than the funeral home. I would love to hear what you all think of these stories. TLDR, I work in death care. These are some of my personal paranormal experiences, as well as some of my colleagues. I recently had an alarming, violent experience at a rural cemetery, and I've been having strange nightmares about it. I've never really visited this sub before, but I wanted to share this story with someone. I really can't find a reasonable explanation for what happened that night. It was just a strange and alarming experience. This all happened a few months ago. My friend had heard that the northern lights would be visible in our area and asked if I wanted to go for a drive out into the country to see if we could catch a glimpse. So we headed out after dark and drove for a while, putting the city behind us and winding out into the countryside, all the while scanning the skies and just searching for a good vantage point where the stars and the lights might be visible. But several hours passed, and with nothing to show for our efforts, we started to give up on seeing the lights altogether. As we discussed what to do next at that point, my friend noted that we were close to her hometown and reminded me that she had been wanting to visit the local cemetery to find the graves of some of her distant relatives. She had recently been researching her genealogy. It was a clear, warm night, and we were both pretty disappointed that we hadn't seen the lights. We both wanted to make the trip worthwhile, so we agreed to swing by the cemetery. We pulled into the dirt road adjacent to the cemetery and walked around until we found the right graves. She took some photos, and we decided to just wander around for a little while. My friend was leading the way, using the flashlight on her phone to light the path and to ensure we didn't accidentally step on any of the graves. I had been feeling increasingly anxious since we arrived, which struck me as just a bit odd. I have done several cemetery seriation projects as an archaeologist and don't normally feel nervous in cemeteries, even at night. In fact, I usually find that cemeteries are pretty peaceful and calming. But I really felt strange in that particular graveyard and found myself frequently spinning around because I felt like someone was standing behind me. Still, I just chalked it up to general anxiety and tried not to dwell on it. One of the problems with having an anxiety disorder is that it's sometimes hard to tell when your nervousness is justified. Even in retrospect, I don't know if my anxiety was just in my head or if it was related to what would happen next. After wandering for a while, we realized that it was approaching 1 a.m. and that we should probably get back home. We turned back and headed toward the car. My friend's car was in sight, and she was a few yards ahead of me when it happened. I suddenly got a wave of that nervous feeling again and thought that I heard someone running up behind me. I was starting to turn my head to look back when I felt something collide with my back, the initial impact hitting me right between my shoulder blades. There was a substantial weight behind it, as if someone had actually hurtled into me. The impact was so forceful that I was thrown forward and fell flat on my face. And as I scrambled to get back up, I felt the weight pressing into my shoulders again and was shoved back down. I then glanced up to see my friend running toward me. She had also heard someone running up to us, had heard my initial fall, and had turned just in time to see me being pushed back down. She would later tell me that she had seen my sweatshirt flattening against my back, and as if someone had been pressing their hands against my shoulders. She grabbed my arm to pull me up just as the weight disappeared, and we both bolted to the car, jumping in and instinctively locking the doors. She wasted no time, starting the engine and then hastily peeled out of the driveway. As soon as we hit the main road, we just sped away from there as quickly as possible. We drove for several minutes without saying a word. I think we were both stunned and, more than anything, confused. She finally glanced at me and said, "What the hell just happened?" I didn't quite know how to answer that. I told her that someone had shoved me to the ground, and she said, "I know, I saw. But what was that? There was nothing there." We tried to come up with a rational explanation, but none of them made any sense. Had someone ambushed me and then bolted? Definitely not. We would have seen them. Had I tripped? No. I had definitely felt something pushing me, and my friend had seen me being shoved back down. Had it been the wind? Not possible. There hadn't been so much as a breeze that night, and if there had been some freak gust of wind, it would have hit my friend too. Perhaps an animal had attacked me, but that didn't seem possible either. There were no local animals large enough, strong enough, and stealthy enough to topple a full-grown human without being seen. I had been in full view of my friend, illuminated by her flashlight, during the second fall, and the weight had remained at my shoulders even as she was coming right up to me. She should have been able to see whatever had been pushing me. If nothing else, an animal would have cast visible shadows beneath the glare of her flashlight. But there was nothing. We just couldn't explain it. Whatever had pushed me, twice, it hadn't been visible to us. As the adrenaline faded, I noticed something else. My back hurt, right between my shoulder blades, right where I had felt the impact. I could feel a sort of stinging, prickly sensation. It felt like my back, despite being covered by my sweatshirt, had somehow been brushed with stinging nettles. I mentioned this to my friend, and she insisted on pulling over to the side of the road to look at my back. She switched the hood light on in the car and pulled the collar of my hoodie down to look. I heard her mutter, "What the fuck?" She took a photo of my back and showed it to me. The skin between my shoulder blades was reddened and several little blisters had started to appear. In the days that followed, the blisters would later swell up and pop. It was as if I had somehow gotten a sunburn or a bad chemical burn. There weren't any scratches or cuts. There were no open wounds, no blood. It was a relatively subtle mark, but it was still clearly there, and it baffled us. We certainly couldn't figure out how I'd gotten burned. I hadn't rubbed up against anything. I hadn't touched my back. I'd been wearing my hoodie all night, and there were no tears or marks in the fabric. And the burn hurt. It continued to sting for several days. I couldn't sleep that night. My back hurt, and every time I started to drift off, I'd suddenly begin to fear that someone was standing over my shoulder, and I would startle awake. I couldn't really understand what had happened at the cemetery, but it truly rattled me. I don't exactly know where I stand on the issues of paranormal phenomena, to be honest. As an anthropologist, I'm trained to keep an open mind, but I still have to rely on a deeply academic and often empirical perspective. Still, I know that something truly bizarre and frightening happened that night, and my inability to explain it, to account for every strange little detail, has been deeply disturbing. It's also been especially difficult to grapple with this because I already have PTSD from a previous assault, and there is something profoundly unsettling about the fact that, in this instance, there was nothing I could have done to defend myself, and with no clear explanation for it, there is no way for me to prevent something like this from happening again. I cannot cope with a fear that I cannot even begin to understand. It has also begun to affect my dreams. I've had several odd nightmares since the incident in the cemetery, dreams that are oddly similar to the nightmares that I had for years when I was growing up. I don't know where they came from, but for as long as I can remember, I've had dreams in which a creature is attempting to lure me in one way or another, and in the dreams I usually understand this creature to be a devil or a demon. Simply put, something evil, something dangerous and, like the entity in the graveyard, difficult to understand. These dreams have become suddenly relevant again, as I seem to have them nearly every time I fall asleep these days. I know that, likely due to trauma, hopefully not due to anything more sinister, these dreams and the experience in the graveyard are somehow linked. Sometimes the menacing creature in my dreams takes the form of an old woman. I had one dream when I was about 13 years old in which I was wandering through a forest. I came across a little cottage with this old woman standing by the porch. She beckoned me inside and I acquiesced. We spent time casually talking and baking cookies, but I felt uneasy around her and got the sense that she wanted something from me. We stayed only in the kitchen throughout the dream, but I can recall glancing at the doorways to other rooms and seeing nothing but shadowy edges. I thought that perhaps I should try to leave, but couldn't remember how to find my way out. At one point, as we sat at the kitchen table, I glanced out the window and noticed a group of people standing in the yard, calling out to the old woman. I asked who these people were, and she told me, "They want me to take them in, but I don't want them. I want you." In other dreams, it has had a more sinister appearance, but I always recognize it as the same creature. I sometimes have dreams in which it is sitting in the dark at my bedside, whispering to me. It has a shadowy appearance with long, lanky limbs and empty eye sockets. Its teeth are made of razor wire, and there is something like blood or wine gleaming on its lips, like this. In those dreams, I can hear it whispering, but I can't understand what it's saying. Sometimes I have dreams of the same creature sitting in a chair in the corner of my room, eating what seems to be a rotten apple. I have long suspected that this creature is some manifestation of my deepest and most troubling fears. I know these are just dreams, but I mention it because those dreams had subsided in my early 20s. But the incident at the cemetery rattled me so much that they've returned. It seems to have shaken my understanding of the world around me, opening the floodgates to my own inner demons. In these new dreams, that creature is standing upright behind me at the cemetery. Time seems to be slowing down. I can sense my friend frozen ahead of me, and the creature is whispering at my back. I don't really know why my mind is conflating that dream creature with my encounter at the cemetery, but the fear has increasingly kept me up at night. I have no idea what the fuck happened that night. My friend believes it was a ghost, but I just don't know. I've never personally experienced anything like this. I really don't know what to do with it. Thanks for reading. Story submitted by Trash Pandex. Haunted dolls? Mediums. Sensitives welcome. Under the assumption that most of you won't have a clue about this, here's the backstory. A post was made here in our paranormal about 2 dolls the poster originally bought at Goodwill. They were meant to be a gift for one of his cousins who collects dolls. He stated that he would hear knocking. His TV would turn off on its own, and he started having nightmares about a woman named Mary. His dog would also whine and block the closet they had been stored in. Thus, understandably, he really did not want to gift them to anyone. A lot of people wanted the dolls, and I got lucky and got both of them. Now, we don't know which one of these is haunted, but I unpacked them as of 20 minutes ago. I will be updating this post as things happen. But please feel free to give any insights. I have a feeling about one of them, but will withhold info. Also, we'll be doing research about when they were made. All I know is one is definitely handmade, and the other may be as well. Haunted Dolls Update. First things first. For all who don't know, I bought 2 dolls, one suspected to be haunted, from another member of this community. I got them, I'd say 30-ish days ago, and placed them on top of my fridge. The previous owner stated that he didn't know which one was haunted, as he got them at Goodwill at the same time. The goal, as a skeptic of haunted dolls, is to see if anything happens and do some investigating. Original post. Nothing happened until today. I came home from work and was changing, and my husband called me into the kitchen to look at something. He didn't say what. I walked in and he was staring up at the dolls. That's when I noticed the Russian doll was turned to the side. He asked if I did that. I said no. He said the same thing. Now, you might be thinking, okay, they're on the fridge, so opening and closing the fridge probably jarred them. Nope. The other Wimbledon doll has not moved, not even a fraction of an inch. Both dolls were firmly on their bases. The Wimbledon doll appears to be looking slightly more to the left, but that's because the photo was taken at a slightly different angle than the original. However, the Russian doll has considerably turned. My husband set the Russian doll back to its original position, and we assumed that we'd wait and see if she moves again. Y'all, not even 10 minutes after he moved her, my fire alarm starts going off. I have lived here since January, and the alarm has never chirped, beeped, nothing. It has never made a sound whatsoever. Yet here it is instructing my family to evacuate because there is supposedly smoke in the family room. We checked everything, changed the batteries, made sure the stove was off and there was no smoke. We don't vape, we don't smoke weed or cigarettes. No one showered recently, and I wasn't cooking. I also checked the alarm for spiders because I read they can set off a false alarm. It went off again twice after we put it back up, but has been silent since. So this part is just oddly coincidental. I'm realizing as I'm writing this that since I got them, I have not been able to sleep. I can't figure out why, but I just can't sleep before 4 a.m., which is not like me at all. I also have a few really bad nightmares, like my mom getting mauled by a bear. My husband also has said I seemed irritated with him more than usual, and all of this is opposite of how we were before I got them. Story submitted by Hello Lily Z. I lived in rural Mexico most of my childhood. I lived with my mom, sister, and dog. My dad was in the USA trying to earn a living and send money to us so we can survive. I was about 6 years old when my big sister turned 15. My dad worked so hard to throw a huge party for her. Everyone in town was invited. There was a band and a huge cake. If you know anything about Mexican 15th birthday parties, you know that the birthday girl always gets a last doll. This doll is supposed to represent her growing up to a woman. My sister was so happy and excited to get her doll. The doll was made out of porcelain, had blonde hair and a peach dress with a matching straw hat. This doll was beautiful. My sister and I shared a room, and when the party was over, my sister took her doll, set it next to her, and slept with her. I remember this so much in detail because I wanted to touch it, but my sister did not let me. The next day, my sister made her bed, arranged her dolls and stuffed bears, and laid her doll right at the center. Nothing happened for a few weeks. My sister would have the same routine on how she made her bed and arranged her toys. One day, when my sister was out of the house, I decided it was time for me to touch the doll. I caressed her face, her blonde curly hair, and even fixed her hat. It was quiet. Too quiet. I remembered getting a strange feeling and I just stared into the doll's eyes. Don't know why, but I did. The feeling was a bit uneasy if I'm honest. I put her back and left the room. That night, I went to bed as usual and said goodnight to my sister. She, as usual, had put all her toys down next to her bed. When I was sleeping, I started to dream that the doll was looking at me. I could see the emptiness in her eyes. All I wanted to do was scream in my dream. I felt like I wanted to run, but I couldn't. I tried so hard to wake up, but I couldn't. When I finally did, I tried to scream at the top of my lungs, but I couldn't. I couldn't scream or even move. My body was paralyzed. I really do not know how long this lasted, but I was able to move again. And when I did, all I could see was the doll on the floor staring at me. I ran to my parents and slept there for the rest of the night. The next day, even though I was terrified to go back and see the doll, I decided to go back into my bedroom. As I go in, I see my sister arranging her toys, but not the doll. She grabbed it and turned it around and placed it somewhere else in the room. We didn't say anything, but I knew she was afraid too. For the next few months, I was afraid to stay alone in that room. The doll would be in different areas of the room and my sister thought I had moved it. I would cry and tell her I only touched her once, but I was to blame. One time, I was in a swing and I swear the doll was there looking at me. I got off the swing and ran back to the house to find the doll sitting down nicely in my sister's bed. We did not tell my mum anything, and as months and years passed, we learned to deal with the doll. I refused to touch her or even look at her. My family eventually moved to the U.S. and we left the doll there, abandoned. As adults, my sister and I talked about the doll, and she too had a dream about her. She said that the emptiness of her eyes freaked her out, and she would always end up in different places. At first, she thought it was me, but now looking back, she says she knew all along that something was moving this doll around. Now, when we visit that old house, and we stay in that room, we turn the doll around and do not move her from her place. That is her room and her space. Story submitted by Succexy. New doll came home. Weird noises started and things moved by themselves. My niece got a little doll as a gift last year. It was from a family member who has not so good a reputation with us. That person has tried to use local witchcraft stuff toward my family in the past. Not that I believe much about it, but it's still family, so my sister accepted it and we took the doll home. Everything was fine before that in the house. My bedroom is located next to the living room while the others are a little bit far away, crossing the living room and the hallway. I only came home for the holidays. I had been there for a week and everything was normal. I get to hear a lot of noise coming from the upper floor. We have a dog there. And from the neighbors because my room is directly above their backyard. The night we brought the doll, everything was quiet. Because it was the day after New Year's. Everybody was sleeping after the celebrations and I was on my laptop talking to some friends. Suddenly, I hear footsteps right outside my bedroom. It didn't bother me because it could have been my sister's husband. They were heavy footsteps, like boots or men's shoes. It sounded like they were crossing the hallway, then the living room and finished in the kitchen. Immediately, I heard the water on the kitchen sink running, and the sound of dishes being washed. It was odd because it was 1:15 a.m., but it could have been someone washing the baby bottles. I kept on listening. After 5 minutes, I heard my niece's playground being dragged from the hallway where it was kept to the living room. It makes a very distinctive noise, and I'm 100% sure that was what I heard. The noise kept going for a good 10 minutes or so. I wrote to my sister to find out if everything was fine but got no response. After that, I kept hearing footsteps. My dog was very nervous and barked at me when I tried to open the door to check out what was happening, so I stayed in the room. I checked the time. It was 1:43 a.m., and the sounds were still going, until they suddenly stopped. I went to sleep, trying not to think about it. The next morning, my sister calls me on the phone and tells me to get out of my room. I did. I went to the hallway and my mum, sister, and her husband were there. My sister asked me if I had put my niece's stroller in front of her bedroom door, and if I had moved the playground station. I said no and told them all about the noises. I thought they weren't going to believe me, but it turns out that my sister came out of her bedroom in the morning. She found the stroller moved. She put it in the right place and went to get the baby bottles and back to the room. After that, her husband got out to drink some water and found the stroller again in front of the door. Moved it and, on his way back, asked my sister why she had put the stroller in front of the bedroom door. They noticed there was something very weird about the situation. Saw my text from last night and decided to call me. We started to freak out a bit and I randomly grabbed the doll that was on the stroller. I noticed a strong smell emanating from it. Dry saliva. It was nauseating. It wasn't there the night before and nobody had touched the thing. It was still in the gift bag. My sister's husband got scared about that fact and decided to throw away the doll. That night, everything was calmed again. It was a weird experience. Story by Worldly Mushrooms 777. Sleep paralysis experiences. A little bit of background. I grew up in a house that was built in the 1960s. Our family moved into the house in the late 2000s. From the start, something was a little off with the house, but it was small things that could be easily explained. With time, things were getting heavier, like TVs turning on and cabinets opening on their own. Around 2017, we started seeing shadows. We would hear someone whisper our name. There was a knocking at the doors and no one was physically there. Anyway, in 2018, one night I was home alone since my family had gone on a trip and I wasn't able to go because of work. I was laying in bed and started experiencing sleep paralysis, something that had never happened to me before and was the only time it ever had so far. While this was happening, I experienced what everyone describes. A dark figure with reddish eyes climbed on top of me and started scratching at me. The weird thing about this sleep paralysis episode was that I also had an out-of-body experience. When the dark figure climbed on top of me, I was able to get it off and get out of bed. I started walking towards my door, but I felt like I was attached to something, like stretching out of it, my physical body. I reached the door and grabbed the knob trying to open the door, but this black figure wouldn't let me. As I struggled, all of a sudden I snapped out of it and woke up in bed. Guys, I could still physically feel the sensation of the doorknob on my hand when I jumped up in bed. It doesn't end there though. My room was somewhat dark. Some light still came in through the window. As I sat there panicking, completely awake, this dark figure was standing at the door of my walk-in closet, just looking at me. My first thought was that I was still dreaming, but as I sat there, it completely vanished. When it disappeared, I started hearing rattling in the kitchen and the chairs at the dining table being dragged around. It was the most bizarre thing. That experience left me spiritually weak. Like after that, any little thing scares me really bad to the point I start having a panic attack. Thankfully, later that year we moved out of the home. Living in another home made me realize there was so much activity there that we grew up to accept as normal, but nothing like it happens in this new home. Story by Vashtistraith. 2 years ago, I would have sleep paralysis so often that I was terrified to even try to sleep. If you're not familiar with what sleep paralysis is, it is a phenomenon in which a person, either during falling asleep or awakening, temporarily experiences an inability to move, speak, or react, accompanied by a feeling of pressure on one's chest and difficulty breathing. It is also accompanied by unusually powerful and terrifying hallucinations, to which one is unable to react due to paralysis. The first hallucination I remember having while undergoing sleep paralysis was it felt like something was dragging its claws down my left arm. I had fallen asleep on my back on the couch in the living room, and I remember opening my eyes a few hours later, but I couldn't move a muscle, and it felt as if I was suffocating. I could feel these claws dragging down my arm, but I couldn't scream. No sound would come out. I felt terrified and felt as if something was watching me. I had a dreadful feeling that I would die and no one would help me. After I had control of my body again, I sat straight up and began to cry and had to call one of my friends to talk to her to maybe keep my mind off the horrible situation. Most of my experiences with sleep paralysis did not come with the hallucinations. They mainly involved the basic symptoms of not being able to move my body, not being able to speak, and feeling as if I couldn't breathe. This next experience I had was the most terrifying. My parents have a really comfortable memory foam bed, and my dad was working and my mom was in another room, so I figured I'd take a quick nap in there. I had done so much research on sleep paralysis after having to suffer with it for ages, and I made a note that most of my experiences happened when I slept on my back, so this time I slept on my stomach. I started to have the feeling of not being able to move, breathe, or speak, and I knew the dreaded sleep paralysis was happening again. This time, I felt someone shaking me, trying to wake me up, and I heard my mother's voice say, "Baby, it's time to wake up." I still couldn't move, so I tried to wiggle my toes and my fingers, hoping to wake my body up. Once I could move, I decided that I was not going to go back to sleep, and I went to the living room. Guess what I saw in there? Not even a few minutes after regaining the ability to move. My mother was asleep on the couch. Story by Karmakatsatari Kari. What exactly did I encounter during my sleep paralysis episodes? Hello, Sleep Paralysis Stories community. I have recently become very interested in the topic of sleep paralysis and am in need of answers. I am well acquainted with the psychological aspect of the events that took place, but find myself in need of answers to the particular entities I've encountered, as well as what they symbolize. I have been absolutely terrified to touch on this topic until I resolved the underlying personal stress that seemed to cause issues I had with sleep paralysis. Since any time I brought it up, my thoughts would stray, and it would often trigger a paralysis episode the same night or a bout of anxiety that inevitably ended in this happening to me. I don't need an explanation for the hallucinations. I'm just curious if anyone has documented the entities from my stories and would be kind enough to tell me who they are, or at least point me to a source of information. I'll be splitting my darkest encounters into parts, as I would like to get this off my chest once and for all. Part 1. The first time anything occurred to me was when I first returned from college. I was under a lot of stress and fell asleep deep in the night, as I was preparing for an upcoming exam and ended up waking to someone embracing me from behind. I wanted to move my arms to see who it was, but the embrace felt so tight I could only move my eyes around the room and saw a leg sitting on the blanket I had over my body. I also heard what sounded like gentle breathing, the kind that you would hear if someone embraced you and then fell asleep before you did. This terrified me, as I remembered I was home alone. I immediately started shaking and trying so damn hard to scream and move either my right arm or leg, basically anything at all, so I could scream and hopefully overpower this intruder. But while I was doing so, I just happened to wake them up. Whatever that thing was let out a guttural growl and reached over me with what looked like a gray, oversized claw and bit into my neck so hard it woke me up. I called my grandmother immediately after and decided to spend a full week there, missing my exam in the process as I was utterly shitting myself at the very concept of being alone with this thing. Part 2. The second time I had sleep paralysis, I was in the college dorm. I'll note for the purpose of this part in particular that the dorm was connected with a state school for children with hearing disabilities, and they would sometimes be very loud, meaning that in spite of the school's placement on the main floor of the building, you could hear them through the entire dorm. I woke up at about 9 in the morning, and the sun was shining at the wall next to my bed, which I was turned towards, my back to the door of my room. I immediately knew something was wrong when I couldn't hear birds chirping outside my window, where they had been nesting since spring began. Suddenly, I started hearing the screaming of the children from downstairs, but amid all the commotion on the main floor I heard it again, the growling noise, this time accompanied by loud, dull footsteps coming down the hall, ever closer to my dorm room. When I got to the door, it started scratching at the door so loud, like someone was dragging metal keys over my door. This freaked me out so bad, I ended up kicking the bed frame and waking up my neighbor, who came to check on me almost immediately after. Part 3. The final time I had a bad bout of paralysis was in May 2023 at my girlfriend's home. We spent most of that week outdoors and decided to have a day home as my allergies were getting the better of me and I really needed some rest. It was about 1 p.m., after a nice meal and some Netflix binging, that I decided to go nap after a full night of waking up nearly constantly. Feeling some sense of accomplishment since I finally spent a whole day walking and exploring, I laid on my back, put my hands under my head and dozed off into a good dream. This is a very funny one because I seriously remember it was in this dream, in a skyscraper I had never seen before, that I entered a room that looked exactly like my girl's. It was in that moment that a woman in my dream turned to me and said, "They're coming, hide quickly." The moment she said that, I heard footsteps again, woke up and noticed two things. One, I felt my hands were locked together, not behind but above my head. Two, there was a shadow with deep red eyes at the foot of the bed, floating, reaching toward my legs with long black fingers. I immediately tried to scream as loud as I could, but my vocal cords would only allow me to wheeze. The footsteps were getting louder and louder again, walking up the steps to outside of the closed door. As the growls and the scratching at the door began once again, the shadow finally touched my left leg. Its touch was cold, so cold it woke my leg and I kicked it, which woke me from the episode. My hands were indeed locked above my head, and I found it hard to pull them apart. In that moment, my girl came into the room, and I started crying because it terrified me so bad. I felt so down that day. The best way to explain it is the feeling you get when a fever finally subsides, and all of your bones end up hurting. Conclusion: I like to keep a clear mind, so I am writing here in order to vent and hopefully get my questions answered. I am still terrified at the thought that this might happen to me again, but it has been much calmer since last year. I do understand these episodes of sleep paralysis were deeply connected to my fractured mental state at the time, but I'd like to inquire if anyone knows more on the topic of these two entities. 1. The growling woman. 2. The red-eyed shadow. Thank you in advance for any useful information you might provide me with. Story by Slight Highlight 120. Scary stories on hiking adventures. I once camped out in Rabbit Valley on the border of Colorado and Utah. I was traveling the country and sleeping in the back of my truck, or in a teepee-style tent I had bought off the Amazon. This particular night, I had set up my tent in a desolate camping area, about 15 to 20 miles from the highway. There was only one other rig in the campsites, and they were pretty far away, so it was nice, quiet, and peaceful. I dozed off for the night and awoke to some odd sounds on my tent. It sounded like someone was dragging their fingers up and down the nylon walking around the tent. I sat completely still and just listened to the whirring of something dragging on the nylon without making a move. About 10 minutes or so went by, felt like an eternity, and the sounds stopped. I laid in my cot and listened for another 15 minutes or so, when all of a sudden my tent capsized and falls down over myself and my cot. A small center support had angled the tent at 45-degree angle, so I could still access the opening. I ripped the zipper open and ran for my truck, crawled into the back, locked the topper from the inside, and grabbed my firearm. I laid awake for the rest of the night until the sunrise, so I could go retrieve my tent, cook stove, cot from the campsite. I arrived at the campsite to inspect the area to see if I was just on the road too long and paranoid, or an intruder or guest had come to visit in the wee hours of the night. Around my tent in the desert dirt and snow were shoe prints making a steady circle around the tent, different size feet than mine in what looked like to be pointed cowboy boots, and they had circled several times and then wandered off into the valley. I've never been back since and still get the heebie-jeebies every time I go tent camping now. Anyone else had a crazy experience while out in the backwoods desert? Story submitted by Rude Awakening. Around 6 years ago, my buddies and I had a little tradition during our senior year of high school where we'd stay out all night, skating, exploring, all kinds of spooky areas. And this was before any of us had a car, so everything was traveled by foot. One night in particular, we had ventured out over an hour from our usual exploration areas, and we came across a heavily wooded area that we hadn't been through before. The time had to have been around 2 or 3 a.m., and just looking into those woods gave me an incredible feeling of unease that I had never felt before. My buddies were determined to go through it, but I decided against it and instead told my friends that I'd just skate, walk around, and meet them at the gas station on the other side. It took me around 30 minutes to skate around the entire area. I waited at the exit of the woods for about 15 minutes before crossing the 4-lane street that led to the gas station. I asked the clerk if 3 other teens had come in. He told me no, so I headed back out to wait in the front. 10 more minutes passed before I can hear heavy footsteps moving quickly from behind the gas station's main building. Next thing I know, I see all 3 of my buddies, sweaty, out of breath, and looking like they witnessed a murder. We headed into the gas station and sat at the small seating area. Then they go on to tell me that somewhere halfway into those woods, they heard strange noises behind them, and when they turned around to look back, they saw a tall, white figure with red eyes staring at them. They said they freaked out and just took off. As they neared the end of the woods, they could hear the leaves and branches rustling as if it were chasing them. They kept running until they crossed the road separating the woods from the gas station, and once they were at the back of the gas station, they looked back and could see the figure just standing at the edge of the woods, unmoving. The way they described was that it only vaguely was shaped like a human, more like a Sasquatch Bigfoot-type creature, but it was white in color and had piercing red eyes. Honestly, I had never seen anyone so distressed in the way my friends were. They genuinely seemed terrified, and that night was one of the last times they ever wanted to stay out all night. I think about this night a lot, even to this day. Story by Sir Robin Hood. An ex-girlfriend of mine used to live on this small rural island in Minnesota, called Grey Cloud Island. At one point, the island had the highest concentration of Indian burial mounds in the county. There is a lot of history there, and at one time it was considered sacred. Across the street from my ex's mailbox was a long, overgrown gravel driveway, blocked off by a rusty chain. On one of our early evening jaunts, we decided to step over the chain and make our way down this driveway, which was a good quarter of a mile long, if not more. The driveway opened up into a small clearing of sorts, in the center of which was all that remained of a home's foundation, then little more than a rectangular patch of concrete. The trees which ringed the clearing were sparse in some places, thicker in others, but even so we could see a lot of the ground beyond the clearing, grassy, humped ground. Trees, nothing else. The ex-girlfriend had a blanket, which she spread out on the patch of concrete. We lay down together and talked for some space, all the while listening to the sounds of the approaching night. Dusk had just crept in, falling over everything like a cold, black cloaking shroud, when he heard the movement in the woods nearby, the stealth crackle of branches crunching leaves. It was very close, much too close for comfort. From the sound of it, it was no more than 20 yards away. Surely we would have heard its approach from a ways off. We got up as if by mutual unspoken agreement, and, in the new dark, made our way to the driveway. The sound of something approaching from the woods changed. It was now in the clearing, where he had been only moments before. As shit-scared as I've ever been, I broke into a run that was immediately arrested by my girlfriend, who urgently whispered, "Don't run. It provokes chase." I did as she bade, and together, in silence, we moved down the driveway, moved as fast as we could without actually running. By the time we got to the street, the sounds were gone. "What do you think that was?" I asked her. "I don't want to talk about it," she said, stone-faced. She was 100% Native American. I knew she knew more than she let on, but regardless of how much I pried, she never told me what it was. To this day, I wonder.
Tonight's story comes from Timely Cheesecake 40, posted only 19 hours ago on Reddit, and what you're about to hear happened in Melbourne, Australia, and is still unfolding as we speak. It all started like most real-life paranormal encounters do, with the small things. Tim had been spending a lot of time at his partner's house, which was close to a forested area. The house itself was relatively new, only about 25 years old. But early on, his partner warned him that strange things happened there. At first, it seemed harmless enough. Footsteps in empty rooms, lights flickering, and doors acting on their own. Maybe harmless is not the best word to use to describe this experience, but his partner would even go on to share something that she labeled as terrifying, waking up in the middle of the night to the sensation of being choked. As she gasped for air, she saw a tall, dark figure looming over her in bed. Understandably, this left her shaken. But as time passed, both Tim and her got used to the occasional disturbances and learned how to live with them. But over the past few months, and remember, this is recent, things started to escalate. One night, his partner had a friend over and they ordered food. She went to use the bathroom and, on her way back to the living room, she heard it. A male voice whispered right into her ear, "How did you like that?" It was so loud, so close, that she couldn't brush it off. The fear was real. Even though she cleansed the house afterwards, believing it might help, it wouldn't stop what was coming next. Tim began noticing more unsettling events. Locked doors starting to open by themselves. There were banging sounds, not just random thuds, but almost like something trying to break through the walls. And then 2 weeks ago, while watching football in the living room, Tim heard it too, a male voice whispering in his ear. He couldn't make out the words, but the sensation was enough to send a chill down his spine. Then, in the same moment, every single light in the kitchen turned on. The room filled with an eerie glow, and one of the children's toys, a flashing wand, lit up on its own. There was no explanation for it. He turned everything off quickly, but the sense of being watched lingered. He went to bed feeling uneasy, but the disturbances only got worse. Nearly every night, they were woken by loud bangs echoing through the house. And last night, which was September 15th, once again, Tim was in bed, his partner asleep beside him. And this was when suddenly, the ceiling fan switched on at full speed. Now, this fan requires a remote to operate. It's not something that could be triggered accidentally. The remote was on the nightstand, pointing away from the fan. The surge of noise woke his partner, and before Tim could process what was happening, he looked toward the doorway and saw it. It was once again a tall, dark figure, at least 7 feet tall, standing at the doorway. It didn't linger long. It moved, stepping away from the door and into the adjoining lounge. Tim couldn't explain what he saw. It was there, and then it was just gone. But that wasn't the end. The next morning, as Tim was heading out for the gym, he heard it again, banging, as if something was trapped inside the house. He tried to ignore it, leaving for his workout. Later, his partner came home after dropping his kids at school and going to the gym herself, and the banging was still there, and it was so loud that she refused to go inside alone. And as if that wasn't enough, just 2 nights ago, that's September 14th, Tim was choked in his sleep, just like his partner had been months before. He woke up gasping for air, with his heart pounding, and with no logical explanation of what had happened. And now, the couple believe that something is building in the house, growing in strength, and also feeding off their fear. Strangely enough, the spirit doesn't seem to affect them when the kids are home. But when it's just the two of them, it's sure to make its presence known. The couple is at a loss for what to do next, and they've sought advice publicly. But where do you even begin when faced with something like this? As they try to figure out their next steps, one thing remains clear. Whatever's in that house doesn't seem like it's going to go away anytime soon. This second story was submitted by Practical Value 6535 on Reddit just 4 days ago. Now, this is a brief but chilling experience that left the user questioning reality. And though the account is short, the figure described is one that's known to many, the Hat Man. But as always, we'll let you decide what to believe. One night, the user was trying to fall asleep when something unusual happened. A shadowy figure appeared in the corner of the room, tall, dark, and unnerving. The figure wore a wide-brimmed hat and a long trench coat. It didn't move. It simply stood there, looming in the dark. The user stared, frozen, waiting for the figure to do something. But it didn't. It just stood there, almost as if it was watching. Then, in an instant, it vanished, and the room fell back into silence, leaving behind an unsettling chill. Now, although this encounter was brief, it would go down as one of the most paranormal moments in the user's life. And as eerie as this sounds, the Hat Man is no stranger to those who've had similar encounters. Now, the figure described in this story is often referred to as the Hat Man, a dark silhouette that has been reported by people all over the world. Always wearing a distinctive hat and a long coat, the Hat Man is known for appearing at night, often while the person is lying in bed or in a half-wake state. What makes him stand out from other shadow figures that have been reported is his chilling consistency in appearance as well as behavior. For decades, people from different countries, cultures, and backgrounds have shared nearly identical accounts of this mysterious figure. Some describe him as standing still in the corner of their room, just as the user above did, while others report feeling an overwhelming sense of dread in his presence. One of the most well-known accounts, in fact, comes from a woman in the United States, where she recalled waking up in the middle of the night to find the Hat Man standing at the foot of her bed, staring down at her with his featureless face. She couldn't move, couldn't speak, and as she tried to break away from her paralysis, the figure slowly disappeared into the shadows. And then another instance in Germany, where a man reported seeing the Hat Man standing in the hallway outside his bedroom door. He described the figure as menacing, but not physically threatening, more like an observer, quietly watching. And yet, the fear that he felt was unlike anything he had ever experienced. The question is the Hat Man a shared hallucination brought on by sleep paralysis, or is he something much more? Many believe that he's a supernatural entity, perhaps even a spirit or a demon. Others think that he's a product of the human mind, manifesting when we're in that vulnerable state between sleep and wakefulness. One thing is for certain, the Hat Man isn't tied to any specific place or person. His appearances are once again random, his presence undeniable, and his victims often feel helpless in his gaze. If you've ever seen something like the Hat Man or have had an encounter that you can't explain, let us know in the comments. If you enjoyed these true stories, don't forget to like and subscribe for more real-life paranormal encounters. And if you've had your own experience with the unknown, please do let us know in the comments, as your story might be the next that we share. But until then, remember, not everything that moves in the shadows is human.